Gordon. Our second presenter this morning is Matthew Wittmer. Mr. Wittmer is a librarian in California, specializing in the collection and preservation of primary sources relating to the Branch Davidians. Mr. Wittmer also recently assisted in editing Clive Doyle's significant book, A Journey to Waco, Autobiography of a Branch Davidian. Mr. Wittmer's presentation is a pictorial introduction to the Mount Carmel property. Matt?
Well, thank you again. Thanks to ISR, thanks to the department and everybody who's made such a gracious welcome, and it's an honor to speak here today. Well, again, my name is Matthew Wittmer, and I was told last night when I was talking to Mr. Melton that I should probably mention that I am a librarian, which was true, so it's a little unusual being in front of a group today, as I usually am roaming around book stacks, helping students find resources on informations like the event that we're here today to talk about. In 1993, when the siege was unfolding at the Mount Carmel property east of Baylor here, I was 21 years old and I was living in southern Missouri. 5 years after the fire that destroyed the building and so many lives on April 19th, I was approached by a filmmaker friend of mine who gave me the director's cut to a documentary called Waco, The Rules of Engagement. And after watching that film, I found that I was really deeply embarrassed and somewhat ashamed of myself for not having made an effort to really understand the many complexities of all the variables that factored into the events that went into that 51-day siege. And I also hadn't made an effort to understand anything about the people who were in the building. So I set out to do that. And at the time, I was a graduate student working at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And that's where I wound up making a three-dimensional model of the building that was destroyed in '93 that was based on available photographs and video that I could find at the time. Siege survivor Clive Doyle wound up installing that model in a very small visitor center museum that was at the front gate of the property for many years when he lived there following the '93 events. It provided the visiting public with an idea of what the building looked like, where it was located, and how it functioned. And it also served as a catalyst for me in better understanding and becoming acquainted with more survivors who all have readily shared their stories and experiences with me about how they came to the community, and they shared with me their insights about where they were in the building. And so today I'm happy to share with you just a few brief highlights of some of the information that I've gathered over the last 14 years. Information that I think would have made my first visit to the property, which occurred 14 years ago, a little bit more of an informed visit versus one that had a little bit more mystery back then. It's photographs like this one. Photographs like this are really how I first learned about Mount Carmel, and I think it's how much of the American public first learned about the Mount Carmel property. I began visiting this building, or the property, I should say, where this building once stood, 7 years after it was destroyed in the fire. In the last 20 years, there's been many memorial efforts made on that property, like the rebuilt chapel that you can see circled here. But many memorial efforts and monuments have sort of come and gone on the property, like the makeshift altar you can see on the right-hand side of the photo. Dozens of memorial trees have been planted in the soil of that land, and today they still grow there, but they're in a different arrangement than you see in this photograph. This is a photo taken 2 years ago and representative of what the property looks like today. Now, this land was actually the second location for a religious community in Waco that began around 1935. It was a group that was known or referred to themselves as the Davidians. The group was founded by, sorry, my slides, just one second. There are two sites in the city of Waco that are kind of have their roots in the Branch Davidian history. The first site was the one that we're all familiar with. It's east of the city. It's referred to as New Mount Carmel. So although the site that we're familiar with that David Koresh lived on east of the city had been Branch Davidian land from 1965 forward, it was initially purchased for Davidians who were moving from an old site that was located in the west of the city that you can see here, known as the Old Mount Carmel site. Let's take a look at some of the remaining traces available at that location. At least 5 streets in that area still bear the names of former Davidians from this initial location. There are still a couple buildings in that area that I think are worthy of mention, circled above. This Davidian church today still bears the name of Mount Carmel Center, and behind it sits a 1-story building that was once the print facility for Victor Houteff, the original Davidian founder in the 1930s. This is that print shop which produced religious literature that was mailed to colleges throughout the world between the 1930s and 1950s. Today, Vanguard Preparatory College across the street from this chapel was initially Victor Houteff's administration building in the 1940s. This is Branch Davidian siege survivor Clive Doyle and Sheila Martin, who took me to that building and helped me understand the history back a few years ago. Now, to get to the new Mount Carmel property that's east of the city, you can see that Baylor is circled below and Loop 340 circles Waco. It's just about 6 miles east of the city on Farm Road 2491, and you go north on EE Road for about a half mile, and you can find the property on your right-hand side. This bird's eye property sketch is taken from the Treasury report, and I show it because it shows the layout of the land in 1993. If you look at the bottom, that's EE Ranch Road, and this is the driveway that circled the building that the community had constructed in the early 90s. If you look at the bottom right-hand side of this slide, you can see the property fence that you'll come to before reaching the driveway, and just inside this property fence sits a very small cemetery that was once called Green Acres. In Green Acres Cemetery, at least 11 people have been buried over the years by both the Davidians and the Branch Davidians. Both of these women did survive the siege of 93, and they're buried in this cemetery. However, Tilly Frieson's husband, Raymond Friesen, and Edna Doyle's granddaughter, Sherry Doyle, were both killed during the events of 93. The name markers and headstones in the cemetery have been moved around, they've been mowed over, and many have been destroyed over the years, so it's hard to get a sense of where the graves are actually located. Now, this is a composite photo taken during the 1993 siege of David Koresh's Mount Carmel Center building. You're looking at the front west side, which is mostly residential rooms. If you look at the photographs right, in the back, you can see that there was a gymnasium that I circle here. And on the far left, there was an old concrete barn that was known as the dairy barn, used in the Davidian era in the 1950s. This is the central residential tower that was made so famous during the 1993 siege through many of the photographs published in the media. Now, in order to get an understanding of what is on the property today, you have to look at the 1993 layout of the buildings during the siege. The building that I highlight next was actually the chapel portion of the complex. It was David Koresh's chapel. There's a swimming pool foundation that was built in 1992 that's slightly north and east of that, which is highlighted here. And to the north of the swimming pool foundation sits an underground tornado or storm shelter that was being constructed at the time of the February 28th raid that you can see highlighted there. You could actually access the inside of the underground storm shelter from inside the building by traversing through a buried school bus that was located here. Now keep your eyes on the swimming pool as I transition into the next photograph, which was an aerial satellite image taken just this past winter, and it gives you an idea of some of the concrete remains still on the property today. You can see that a building has been reconstructed where the former chapel once stood, and these squares that are highlighted here indicate foundations that still exist on the property from the Davidian houses from the 1950s. Those houses were dismantled in the early 90s to help build the communal building made so famous. Now, this is the memorial model of the building that I created in 1999. Behind the residential row of buildings sat the chapel, which is highlighted here sort of in a blue color. Behind the chapel was a gymnasium that I tint with sort of a purple color. You couldn't actually access the gymnasium through the chapel because at the time of the raid, it was a new building and it was only accessible through an outside door. Now, in 1998 and 1999, volunteer efforts joined together to rebuild a chapel for the 1993 siege survivors. And by 2000, this building was dedicated, and today it actually sits directly over the footprint of where the former chapel once stood, although the current chapel is a little bit larger in scale than the former one. I'd like to take a look at the property again from 1993, but only from the vantage point of the gate. This is a screenshot from video taken directly after the initial raid on February 28th. You can see ATF agents walking away from the building. If you look at the two telephone poles underneath the first two arrows, those exist on the property today and have served as mapping points in helping me understand how large the building was. Behind the third arrow sits a three-story residential tower in which obscures David's chapel. And that's where the chapel that was reconstructed in 2000 sits today, as seen in this diagram. Now, as I transition into a photo taken just 2 years ago, you can see that 82 memorial trees line the property's driveway today. The reconstructed building that you see is just simply one, and it's the smallest building of that 1993 complex that's kind of overlaid here. All of the 5 buildings that were in the 93 layout were completely destroyed on the 19th and in the culminating fire that occurred just after noon on that day. This is one of the telephone poles that sat closest to the chapel then, and it sits closest to the chapel today. And this is that same telephone pole from April 19th. You can see it just outside the gymnasium amidst the tank tracks that circled the complex. Now, this is the back side of the building where a kitchen that you can see here was located. The kitchen was right next to the central residential 4-story tower that was built over an old church records vault from a previous building on the property. It's referred to as a bunker sometimes in government reports. The vault was actually the only standing structure within the building after the April 19th fire. And as you can see, there's only one way in and one way out of the vault. It's a door that faced westward, and if you look at my diagram with the small box, it was located here. The only way to get to the top or upper levels of that residential tower was to enter from the west second level run of rooms from the front of the complex through a very small corridor, which was circled here. This is actually where David Koresh was situated throughout much of the 1993 siege after he was wounded on the February 28th gunfight. It was inside this concrete room where the bodies of 15 children were discovered, as well as 5 women. The concrete room was bulldozed into a pile of rubble shortly after all of the evidentiary value was gathered. The largest concrete structure to remain on the property intact, besides the concrete vault that was actually destroyed, was the swimming pool foundation that you can see highlighted here, as well as a large concrete slab that was the former floor of the gymnasium that sits behind the reconstructed chapel today. And to the north of both of these structures, you can see the underground storm shelter, which has been collecting rainwater for some time. I'd like to step back and look at the property before the Branch Davidians were on it. This is an aerial photo taken probably from the late 40s or early 50s, before any buildings were actually on the property. This is where the driveway would eventually be established when the Davidians moved here and purchased the land. So initially, this was Howdiff's Davidian community that moved here from Old Mount Carmel site. And you can see that there was a lot of building activity on this slide. But remember, by 1965, this would become Branch Davidian property when the property was managed by Branch founder Ben Roden and his wife Lois. Let's take a look at 3 buildings on the property. The one that circled first at the lower portion of this photo was a chapel that was built in the 50s, and it lasted until the late 1980s. It was used by both the Davidian and Branch Davidian communities, and in 1989, half of the building was dismantled to begin to build the communal building on the administration building site. Eventually, the entire chapel was taken down. The next building at the driveway's corner was the home of Ben and Lois Roden. You can see that those two houses behind this picture of David Koresh and David and Perry Jones. All three men were found killed in the remains of the 1993 fire. The next and largest building from the Davidian era was the administration building. The administration building kind of had an I-shaped layout, and it was nestled around that church records vault that you can see here notated by the square. The back portion of this building was a print shop that was used first by the Davidians and later by the Branch Davidians to print religious literature that was mailed to colleges pretty much all over the world. To the north of the administration building sat 13 small residential houses in which a woman named Catherine Madison had lived for many years. Catherine Madison was Lois Roden's assistant after Ben Roden passed away, and she would later go on to become a part of David's community, and she would bring out David's message that was a radio sermon message early in the 1993 siege. Catherine passed away in the city of Waco in 2009. These two women were also a part of the Branch Davidian community, and you can see them standing here in front of those little residential houses in the 1980s. Both women came out of Mount Carmel on March 19th, 20 days into the siege. Behind those houses in the Davidian era, there were 11 large storage barracks that lasted for about 2 decades. Some were dismantled, others had fallen down, and one was destroyed by a fire. To the east, or at the top of the photo, also sat the cinder block dairy barn that was used in the Davidian era. Now, in 1983, an accidental electrical fire completely destroyed the administration building, and you can see its footprint highlighted here in the gray portion. And as you can see, the only thing remaining from that building is that one-level church records vault that I highlight here. This is how the property appeared for the next several years when Branch founder Ben Roden's son, George Roden, moved onto the property and renamed it Rodenville Branch Center. George had a history of mental instability and a volatile temper, and at this time, David and his community lived on a tract of land in Palestine, Texas, for several years. In 1987, George was arrested, and David and community then moved back onto the property and began building a community residential center over the site of where the administration building had once existed. You can see that building in its early phases of construction from this Channel 2 News screenshot from 1987, I think. This is the same building, picture taken from the Treasury report, and this section of the building that I highlight here is what we were just looking at. You can see that a chapel has been added and is extending eastward, and it added 2 additional second-story level bedrooms. This is the same time frame, only looking westward. This is Double EE Road, and this tract of land is where those storage barracks had once stood. In their place, you can see very tiny, small shacks that were actually some of the houses that were brought from the Palestine property and positioned here on the Mount Carmel property. And here's the building as it slowly started to develop. Now, in the 1990s, the community began disassembling those residential houses and reusing the lumber to create both the 4-story residential tower that you can see, as well as expand the building northward. Eventually, another 3-story tower was added on the south end that I circle here. You can see before it has any windows. And eventually, by 1993, there was another identical tower on the north end of the complex. To see the interior layout of the building, I really encourage you to pick up a copy of Clive Doyle's autobiography, A Journey to Waco, which was published just this last year by Rowman and Littlefield. This is an overhead aerial photograph taken during the siege, but I've simplified it into a line drawing to call attention to just a couple things. The 2 houses on the very bottom of the slide that are orange were originally Davidian houses in the 1950s when the Davidians owned that parcel of land when they originally purchased the property. However, in 1992 and 1993, ATF and FBI agents used those houses as a forward-looking observation post during the 51-day siege. The dairy barn on the top of this photo, or on the east end of the property, was also used as a similar post for government agents during the siege. You can see the building still exists, and this is how it looked just this past year in April of 2011. Now there were the swimming pool and the underground storm shelter here behind the complex actually acted as a natural barrier for the tanks throughout the siege, as they could not approach the building that close from that because of those structures. You can see those structures here in this government exhibit photograph as I shade them in gray. This was taken on April 19th as a tank entered the front part of the building to insert gas into the central residential tower into that one-room concrete vault. If you look at the top of the photo, you can see a tank pulling away from the northeastern side of the gymnasium, which has been completely destroyed. This is an aerial photo of that same building, but from the first week in the siege. And the reason that I show it is because it gives you an idea, when I transition to a photograph of how the property looks today, of how much land space this building used to occupy. This is the swimming pool. After the fire and the vault and part of the storm shelter were bulldozed, the rubble of that concrete was stacked into the shallow end of the swimming pool where it sat for many years. This is a photo from 13 years ago, and you can see the rubble at the far end. In the mid-1990s, a man named Charles Pace moved onto the property. Charles was not a part of David's community. Charles was not in the building throughout the 51-day siege. He is the person that now tends to the property's needs and has been the sole person to kind of do that for the last 6 or 7 years. He removed the rubble from the end of the swimming pool in the last 3 or 4 years, and as of this past year, he's removed all the water from the swimming pool and hopes to make it an aquaponic garden. Now this is the underground storm shelter seen 13 years ago. There was a covered end that you can see on the top, and there was an uncovered end on the bottom. The uncovered end allowed rainwater to come in and slowly deteriorate the covered end of the shelter. The circled item is a school bus that can be seen during the 1993 siege footage. It sat north of the complex, right about here, and it was on the property up until about 7 or 8 years ago when it was removed, probably sold for scrap metal. This is a shot of the underground storm shelter, again, as it began to fall apart in 2009. The storm shelter is where survivor Clive Doyle had buried Jadine Wendell, Winston Blake, Peter Hipsman, and Perry Jones. All 4 were killed in the shootout that occurred on the 28th, and they were buried in this storm shelter during the negotiation phase of the events. This is the dividing wall that separated those two covered and uncovered portions. By 2010, rain had completely filled the foundation, destroying most of the covered end. And again, this is that dividing wall. You can see me as I'm walking along the top of that dividing wall, and everything to the photograph's left has been removed by the property resident, Charles Pace. Branch Davidian survivors planted memorial trees that were crepe myrtle trees on the property 2 years following the fire. Those trees have existed on the property until this day and are really the longest memorial effort to exist there since the fire. They were originally positioned in front of where the building had once stood in a grid-like fashion, as you can see right here. And this is the trees in 2008. These are the trees. By 2000, each tree had been fitted with a personal name stone that showed the name, nationality, date of death, and the age of every Branch Davidian who was killed in the 93 siege. By 2006, Charles Pace had removed all these name stones from the individual trees, and he stacked them at various places on the property. Years before he did it, I had gone to the property and created rubbings of the name stones, and I archive those today on my website, stormbound.org, where I devote one page to sort of chronicling the visual history of the property. I also archive the grouping of names as created by the survivors, because it's kind of shows how they wanted their family members to be remembered It's grouped according to family. Now, in April of 2009, Charles Pace uprooted, pruned back, and replanted all of those trees from their original location to along the property's driveway. As of the following year, they actually had taken root and could be seen blooming here. And as of last year, they seem to be doing okay. Now, there have been many private efforts to memorialize those killed in '93 by installing monuments on the property, but the monuments have been altered if they've lasted that long on the property. This is one of the first efforts. It was a single stone with all the names of the Branch Davidians killed. It was originally positioned in front of where the trees sat, but Charles Pace moved that stone from that location to near the front gate, where eventually by 2010, he had actually positioned all the name stones stacked on 2 walls around it, eventually cementing all of them together into one large memorial. As of last year, a concrete floor was added that was equipped with flag post holes to fly flags from the countries of origin of everyone who was killed. You can see the flags there. Alongside one of the name stones also sits Charles Pace's marble sort of timeline progression of Branch Davidian and Davidian prophets. There's also a monument that honors the 4 ATF agents that lost their lives in the line of duty on that February 28th shooting. Also, there's this Oklahoma City bombing that pays homage to the victims of that disaster that occurred on the anniversary of the Mount Carmel fire on April 19th. The large branch marble sign that sits at the property's front gate was also created by Charles Pace. And in 2006, the Waco Tribune-Herald ran an article that basically highlighted this stone and talked about the theological differences between Charles Pace and survivor Clive Doyle. Both had shared and lived on the property for several years, and it was in 2006 that Clive decided to move back into the city of Waco after having spent nearly 30 years of his life on the Mount Carmel property and losing his teenage daughter, Sherry Doyle, in the fire on April 19th. So I show these stones and trees to just let you know that they were originally survivor efforts to remember family and friends who were killed, but the reorganization of them by a non-survivor has left many of the survivors feeling as if their efforts to remember their loved ones as being stripped from them and really erased or obliterated. I'd also like to mention that Clive ran and operated a visitor center museum that was near the property's front gate for several years that exhibited government photographs from the trial, books about the events, survivor recollections were posted along the wall, and photographs from families of all of those killed were displayed in this museum. The museum's contents were packed up and went into storage when Clive moved off the property. And in the last 7 years that I've been to the property, I found the building locked and empty. I thought I'd end with just mentioning that 30 of the 82 people who were killed in that event are buried in Waco's McLennan County Westland Cemetery. They're in rows 6 through 8. This is one of the stones for Cyrus Howell, who was 8 years old when he died. Each of these stones is engraved with the Tarrant County's medical examiner's autopsy number that can be seen at the base of the stone. Each of them starts with an MC, and I'm assuming that stands for Mount Carmel. You can confirm the number by looking at the first page of every autopsy report that was issued. I've always found the notion to inscribe a personal grave marker with an evidence number as very troubling, because it seems to overlook the dignity that anyone who has died, or in this case, every one of them was killed, rightly deserves at the location of their burial. Westland Cemetery is just south of Baylor's campus. It's just south of the more predominant Oakwood Cemetery. The plots there always remind me of the many people that lived on the Mount Carmel property. The property itself, for me, has been a resource. It's been like a document. And as one of the FBI negotiators said to Steve Schneider on March 17th during the siege, he said, "Steve, this property speaks to what happened here." And I think that that holds true today. You've seen that the survivor efforts to remember their family has met with resistance there. It's my hope that survivor voices and stories are afforded more venues like this, where they can become a more permanent and have a more prominent place in the public record on this event. The tremendous amount of suffering that's been endured for the last 20 years, I don't think can ever be removed from that property, and the property will always be associated with the city. And I appreciate that the school today takes a moment to remember that event and look at these issues and engage people in thinking about how things could have been done different or better. Thank you.